Welcome back, everyone, to Occult Archives. We're the show that, well, we kind of open up these old, often really intense books and try to figure out what makes them tick, you know?
Yeah, it's like beyond just like the surface level stuff. We really want to get into the nitty-gritty of the ideas that are hidden inside.
Right. Not just like, oh, this book is about this. It's more like, what were the people who wrote these books? What were they actually trying to
Oh,
get at?
exactly. And today we're going deep, like really deep.
Oh, yeah. We're talking forbidden eroticism,
Mm.
sacred marriage stuff,
Mm.
and even like a whole secret gospel about sexual mysticism, all from this one writer, Craddock.
Oh, she's fascinating. Lived right at the turn of the 20th century, 1894 to 1902. That's when most of her stuff was published.
And we've got a whole bunch of her writings here, a real treasure trove,
Mm.
including psychic wedlock, which is pretty much her blueprint for a marriage that's firing on all cylinders, you could say.
And then there's Heavenly Bridegrooms. Yeah, that one goes into some pretty wild territory, we could say.
Let's just say she had some unusual ideas about spiritual partners.
Definitely unconventional. But hey, that's why we're here, right? To explore these kind of hidden corners of history.
Exactly. So what we're going to try to do today is really get inside Craddock's head, see how she connected physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of a relationship, especially in marriage.
Right. And also, she goes pretty deep into historical and occult beliefs about sacred sexuality. I mean, some of this stuff was super taboo back then.
Oh, absolutely. Still can be, honestly. So we're going to stick to the content of what she wrote, try to understand her perspective given the time period and all that.
Right. Just present the ideas as she laid them out.
Exactly.
And
Okay, so first up, let's tackle this psychic wedlock thing. What's the core idea there?
so Craddock starts with this kind of foundational concept. She
Hmm.
says marriage, it isn't just like two physical bodies together, there's more to it.
Okay, right.
She says there's three levels, three interconnected levels: physical, intellectual, and spiritual. And to have like a truly complete and happy union, you got to have balance.
Dallas, yeah.
An exact equation of energy expended across all three. That's how she puts it.
Like a three-legged stool. If one leg's like way shorter, the whole thing's going to tip over.
Exactly. So if you've got too much emphasis on, say, just the physical, well, she calls that lust. And yeah, she's pretty clear that she sees that as a bad thing.
Like a big no-no in her book.
Oh, yeah. She even says, right-thinking people turn from it with a shudder. You can tell she's reflecting the morals of her time there.
Gotcha. Okay, so too much physical, bad. What about if the connection's mostly intellectual, like you're sharing ideas, you're maybe making art together, that kind of thing?
That she sees as more of a partnership, which, can be great, of course. But if there's no physical aspect at all, then it's not really wedlock to her, more like a really close friendship.
A meeting of the minds, but not like a full union.
Yeah.
Okay, then what about the opposite? What if it's all about the spiritual? Like
Mhm.
you have these moments of intense, like ecstatic connection, but that's pretty much it.
She says, yeah, those can happen, these raptures, she calls them, but they're not sustainable long term. Like you can't just live off those peaks. You need the intellectual and the physical grounding too.
So it all comes back to balance.
Yeah, finding that equilibrium between the duties and the joys, that's her key to a successful psychic wedlock. And this is where she starts to critique some of the religious views that were common back then.
Right. Her take on Christianity at the time is pretty interesting. It seems like she felt they were a little too focused on like suppressing the physical side of things.
Oh, yeah. She says they kind of demonized the physical intimacy within marriage. Like it was this base, even sinful thing.
And she points to like the Apostle Paul, right?
Yeah.
Better to marry than to burn, that kind of thing.
Right. And a lot of the early church fathers, she says, they were all about perpetual virginity. Like that was the most spiritual ideal.
So no sex at all, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. And Craddock's problem with this is that, well, it left young people totally unprepared.
Like they weren't getting any real guidance about sex.
Exactly. I mean, she even asks point blank, where were people actually learning about this stuff? And her answer is pretty brutal.
Yeah. It's not a pretty picture. Prostitute schoolboys, I mean,
Yeah.
not exactly the best sources of information.
Right. And she even throws in depraved men and French novels, which is kind of funny, but also, like, you can see her point. People were going into marriage with all these messed up ideas.
And she says that this lack of, like, proper education, it led to these two extremes. You had the people who were, like, completely disgusted by sex, the prudes, basically.
And then on the other hand, you had the folks who were just focused on the physical, like no deeper connection at all.
Right, just pure lust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she basically blames the churches for this, the prudish silence, she calls it.
So she's saying that, like, when you have these powerful institutions that are, like, shunning a natural part of human experience, it messes people up.
Yeah, creates all these imbalances, both personally and within society.
Gotcha. And then she brings up these other societies, these pagan and what she calls savage societies, and she's almost praising them for their approach to sex.
It's really interesting. She sees them as having this reverence for the sexual relationship. Like it's dignified, even holy to them.
And they express that through all these rituals and stories and dances.
Right. And they have this figure, the medicine man, who actually teaches the young people about their marital duties. And he does it in a way that like acknowledges the mystery and the power of sex.
So it's not like this shameful thing.
No, not at all. And she contrasts that with modern society, where you have the priest, the doctor, the teacher, all these separate roles.
But they're not really talking to each other?
Exactly. And she thinks that's led to this breakdown of like a more holistic view of sex education.
So she's calling for like a return to a more integrated approach.
Yeah, using all the modern knowledge we have now, embryology, physiology, psychology, all that.
And she seems to think people were ready for that.
Oh, yeah. She says there's this societal eagerness for positive sex education. It's kind of wild to think about, given how controversial her own ideas were.
Totally. Okay, so then she gets into these 3 degrees of initiation into psychic wedlock. And this is where things start to get a little mystical.
Definitely entering esoteric territory here.
Yeah.
She ties these degrees to ancient pagan religions and what she calls borderland occultism.
Borderland occultism.
Yeah, it's like this liminal space between the physical and the spiritual. And the thing is, she says, the higher degrees, the second and third, they were kept secret.
Like only for the initiated.
Exactly. You had to prove yourself worthy to learn these teachings.
Okay, but while the secrecy, she does explain that, right?
Right. She says it's because back in the day, people didn't understand science the way we do now.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like they didn't have the tools to really grasp these concepts.
Yeah. Right. And psychology, she says, was in its infancy. So these advanced teachings about like the spiritual side of sex, they could be easily misinterpreted or even used for like bad purposes.
So they were protecting this knowledge.
Yeah, safeguarding it from those who weren't ready for it.
She even uses the example of temple sleep, right?
Mhm.
Which we now know is like hypnotism.
Right. The ancients had all these interpretations of it, but now we have a more scientific understanding.
So she's saying that even in her time, people were starting to study things like hypnotism and telepathy more scientifically.
Yeah, but the specific effects of like mind on mind during sex, that was still largely unexplored. And she thought it was a really important area to understand.
Especially because of the potential dangers. She talks about that displaced psychophysical threshold during moments of ecstasy, right?
Right. Like when you're in that heightened state, you're more susceptible to certain influences.
And she uses the example of conception happening while one or both partners are intoxicated.
Yeah, she says that could have a negative impact on the child.
So her point is that the ancients, even without modern science, they knew that self-control during sex was crucial.
Exactly. And that's why they kept the second degree so secret.
Because it was all about self-mastery.
Right. And she even suggests that it gave people more control over procreation and potentially even made things more pleasurable.
Okay, that makes sense. And she seems to think that by the late 19th century, people were becoming more educated, so maybe they were ready for this knowledge.
Maybe. So let's break down these degrees. The first degree, she says, is basically sex is only allowed for having kids.
Whoa, okay, so no fun allowed.
Well, she's got her reasons. She's critiquing the way people were interpreting the whole be fruitful and multiply thing.
Right.
She thinks they were using it as an excuse to just have sex all the time without any thought or intention.
Like they were twisting the meaning.
Exactly. And she mainly blames men for this, but she does say wives are complicit too. She even tells this story about a woman who says she's happily married, but is secretly relieved when her husband doesn't want to have sex with her.
Wow. So even back then, there were relationships where the desires weren't really matching up.
Yeah, and Craddock's point is that the woman should be the one who decides.
Like it shouldn't be forced on her.
Right. If she's not feeling it, then it's a fraud, she says. It degrades her.
Oof. Okay, so First degree, super strict. What about the second degree?
Okay, so this one gets even more intense. She says no ejaculation except for making babies, and even like natural lubrication is off limits.
Whoa, hold on. That sounds like physically impossible.
Right, and she knows people are going to think that. She even addresses the whole idea of repression being unhealthy.
Yeah, I was going to say, that can't be good for you.
So she brings up this doctor, Brown Seacard, who had this theory about like how holding back actually makes you stronger and live longer.
Okay, interesting.
But even Craddock admits that he got some things wrong. She says the key is that you need natural excitation alongside the self-control. It can't be all about just shutting everything down.
So it's got to be this balance of like desire and restraint.
Yeah, that's the idea. And she says that the power you develop in the second degree, it's not just physical, it's psychic.
Okay, so we're getting into some real mind over matter stuff here.
Oh, yeah. And she sees ejaculation as a waste of that psychic energy, like you're losing something valuable.
Okay, so the second degree is all about like mastering that energy.
Exactly. And there are two main parts to it. First, you got to learn to completely shut down ecstasy, like no matter how long things go on.
Wow, that's some serious willpower.
Right. And then the second part is you got to learn to experience full ecstasy, but with total control, no ejaculation.
Okay, so you're like riding the wave but not letting it crash.
That's a great way to put it. And she specifically says this goes beyond what they were doing in the Oneida community.
Yeah, United community.
Yeah, you know, those folks who were all about communal living and complex marriage.
Oh, right, right.
So she's saying this is even more advanced than that. And she uses this analogy of like fighting your way through a raging river.
Like it's a struggle, but you eventually overcome it.
Yeah. But she also warns about the dangers. Like, if you're not prepared, you could get swept away.
Spiritually and maybe even physically.
Right. She says you could end up indulging in other areas or even have health problems. So it's not something to be taken lightly.
Gotcha. And she makes a point that the second degree by itself, it's not enough. You need the third degree to really complete it.
Yeah, otherwise it's just self-denial without any higher purpose.
Okay, so what's the third degree all about?
This is where it gets really interesting. She calls it community with deity. Like, God is the third partner in the marriage.
Whoa. So now we're talking about like bringing the divine into the bedroom.
Pretty much, yeah. And she emphasizes that this degree is all about the spiritual connection. The physical and even the mental control, they become secondary.
Okay, so it's like a whole other level of union.
Exactly. And she says it's the highest and most fulfilling degree.
Okay, so that's psychic wedlock. A lot to unpack there. But now let's move on to this this Heavenly Bridegroom's essay. The title alone is like, whoa.
Yeah, that one definitely sparks the imagination. She starts by talking about Genesis 6.2, you know, the part about the sons of God and the daughters of men.
Right, the whole like angels coming down to earth and having kids with human women.
Exactly. And she uses that as a jumping off point to explore this whole idea of like unions between earthly beings and spiritual beings.
Like interdimensional relationships.
Yeah, basically. And this is where she introduces Ida C.
Ida C.
Yeah, she was a college teacher who had these like erotic hallucinations that she thought were spiritual experiences.
Okay,
I
interesting.
mean, Craddock uses her as a case study to understand what she calls the erotogenesis of religion.
Erotigenesis. Sounds complicated.
Basically, it means that sexual experiences can be a driving force behind religious beliefs and practices.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Like how your sexual experiences can shape your spirituality.
Exactly. And Ida C., she was really adamant that her experiences were real. Like, she wasn't just imagining things.
She really believed in them.
Oh, yeah. And she even wrote a whole manuscript about being the earthly wife of an angel.
Wow. So she's like a guide to connecting with the spiritual realm through sexual experiences.
That's the idea. And it all happens on this place she calls the borderland.
The borderland.
Yeah, it's like this in-between space that connects the physical world with the afterlife.
Like a bridge between realms.
Exactly. And she sees all these religious and folkloric traditions as like signposts along the way. They give you clues about how to navigate this borderland.
Okay, so she's drawing on all these different sources to build her understanding.
Right. And she even connects it to Christianity. She says the birth of Jesus could be seen as a borderland union.
Like Mary and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Or even Mary and God himself. And she says that even if it was a divine event, it still had to follow the rules of the borderland.
So she's not afraid to like reinterpret these traditional stories.
Not at all. And she also talks about how ancient teachings about marital purity and self-control, they've kind of been lost.
Like people have become too focused on the sensual side of things.
Right. And she even uses her own experience as an example. She defended belly dancing based on her relationship with her spirit husband.
Oh, wow. I bet that didn't go over well back then.
Definitely raised some eyebrows. People accused her of, like, having affairs or even being insane.
Because she was a woman talking about these things openly.
Exactly. She felt there was this double standard. Like, if a man said it, it was fine. But if a woman said it, she was crazy.
Right.
And she specifically says there are 3 things you got to consider in her case. 1, she's an unmarried woman. 2, she's writing about all this unusual marriage stuff. And 3, she claims to be married to a ghost. And she says you can't ignore any one of those factors if you want to understand her.
So it's all interconnected.
Yeah. And then she makes this appeal to all these different groups: free thinkers, spiritualists, theosophists, occultists.
Like she's trying to reach out to anyone who might be open to these ideas.
Exactly, but she also warns them about the dangers of the borderland. Like, it's not all sunshine and roses.
It's a wild frontier.
Yeah, she says there are all these pitfalls. And she talks about the history of witches and how modern occultism can be too focused on either, like, free love or strict abstinence.
So she sees a need for, like, some ethical guidelines.
Oh, absolutely. And she thinks these relationships with spirit, bridegrooms, and brides, they're way more common than people realize.
Okay, so it's not just her.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And she wants to create a map, like a guide to navigating the borderlands safely.
So you don't end up as, like, the devil's mistress or something.
Right. She wants to help people find their way to the good stuff, the angelic unions.
Okay, so she's like a spiritual explorer.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And she says that the whole heavenly bridegroom thing, it's not just a Christian idea. It's found all over the world throughout history.
Really?
Yeah, and it's usually associated with pure women, like virgins or women who are known for being chaste.
Okay, so there's this whole tradition of, like, spiritual purity being connected to these unions.
Exactly. And in Christianity, she points to the Holy Spirit and Christ himself as examples of heavenly bridegrooms.
Right, the Holy Spirit in the Annunciation and in Christ as the bridegroom of the church.
Yeah. And then she goes back to Genesis 6.2 and she gives her own interpretation of it.
Which is
She questions the whole fallen angel thing.
like the idea that the sons of God were actually angels who rebelled against God.
Right. She points out that Genesis itself focuses on the wickedness of humans as the reason for the flood, not like the angels being bad.
So she's not buying that interpretation.
No. And she also brings up the Book of Enoch, which is often used to support the fallen angel idea. She says it's not part of the official canon.
So it's not as authoritative.
Right. And then she connects it to theosophy.
Theosophy.
Yeah, it's this kind of esoteric spiritual philosophy.
Yeah.
And they have this idea of black sorcerers who misuse magic for their own gain.
Okay, so she's saying that the angels weren't necessarily evil. They just might have been misused by humans.
That's a possibility, yeah. And she emphasizes this occult principle that you got to be living right and thinking clearly if you want to communicate with the spiritual realm.
So your own inner state matters a lot.
Absolutely. And then she brings up the Psychical Research Society.
Those folks who are studying all those, like, psychic phenomena.
Yeah. And they found that even ordinary people can have these hidden senses. Like, they could do things like telepathy or see wraiths.
Wraiths?
Like ghostly doubles of living people.
Whoa, okay.
But she also warns about, like, visions of the dead. She says those are less reliable.
So you got to be discerning.
Yeah. There are lying spirits out there, she says.
So be careful who you trust in the spirit world.
Exactly. And then she gets into the whole history of how the early church fathers viewed angelic bridegrooms.
What did they think?
Well, most of them took the stories in Genesis and Enoch literally.
So they believed it really happened.
Yeah, but they had all these different explanations for why the angels came down to earth.
Like what?
Some said it was God's will. Others said the angels were just disgusted with humanity. Some even said the women were, like, tempting them.
So a whole range of interpretation.
Yeah. And they also had different views on the nature of the relationships. Some saw them as lovers, others as husbands.
Okay, so they were trying to make sense of these stories.
Right. And some of them even connected to the sin of Sodom. Like, maybe there was some kind of astral influence going on there.
Astral influence.
Like beings from other realms messing with earthly affairs.
Okay, interesting.
And Tertullian, he even argued that the angels were the actual husbands of virgins.
Wow. Okay.
But here's the thing, even though they believed in these angelic marriages, they still thought it was a sin for the angels to do it.
Why?
Because they had this really low view of earthly marriage.
Like they thought it was beneath the angels.
Yeah. They saw it as a concession to human weakness.
Mhm.
The ideal was to be a virgin.
So they thought the angels were, like, lowering themselves by getting married.
Right. And they also condemned the angels for, like, teaching human stuff and making the world more beautiful.
Wait, that's a bad thing.
They thought so because they believed the angels were fallen, so anything they did was tainted.
So they basically rejected all their contributions.
Yeah. And Craddock contrasts that with, like, Sir Thomas Browne, who saw these angelic actions as good things.
So it's all about perspective.
Right. And she also talks about the traditions of angels wanting power and demanding sacrifices. But she thinks those might be based on misunderstandings.
Like we're projecting our own fears onto them.
Exactly. And the whole thing about giants being the offspring of angels and humans, she's not so sure about that either.
She thinks there's more to the story.
Yeah. She emphasizes that you need to be living right and thinking clearly to really communicate with the spiritual realm.
So maybe the giants weren't actually evil. Maybe they were something else entirely.
Maybe. And then she moves on to, like, folklore and stories about miraculous births.
Like, what kind of stories?
She mentions Robert le Diable, who is supposed to be the son of an incubus, and Merlin, who is said to be the child of an incubus and a holy woman.
Wow, okay. So these are stories that have been around for a long time.
Yeah, and even in her time, people were still claiming to have immaculate conceptions.
Like outside of the religious context.
Right. And Craddock is skeptical, but she also acknowledges that there's usually some truth behind these stories.
Like where there's smoke, there's fire.
Exactly. And she even draws a parallel with the birth of Jesus.
Like if you dismiss all these other stories, you have to question that one too.
Right. And then she goes on to talk about beliefs in unseen bridegrooms and brides all over the world.
So it's not just a Western thing.
Not at all. She mentions all these different cultures, the Antilles, New Zealand, Samoa, Lapland.
Wow. So it's really widespread.
Yeah. And she talks about how these beliefs are often associated with specific rituals and ordeals.
Like tests you have to pass to be worthy of a spiritual spouse.
Right. And she also notices that there are more stories about heavenly bridegrooms than brides.
Why do you think that is?
She thinks it's because women were generally more self-controlled back then.
So they were more open to these experiences?
Maybe. And she contrasts that with men, who she says were more prone to, like, drinking and other indulgences.
Which she thinks dulls your spiritual senses.
Right. And she specifically mentions India as a place where they have a more positive view of sex.
Like she thinks that might make them more receptive to borderland unions.
Possibly. And then she gets into the whole idea of what kind of sensitivity you need for these relationships.
Like, are we talking about like ESP or something?
She says the sense of touch is the most important.
Really?
Yeah. And she says that for a borderland husband to be real, he has to be able to materialize to some extent.
So you can actually feel him.
Right. And she even quotes Rousseau about how, like, if you could extend the happiness of love into marriage, you'd have paradise on earth.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And she says that's what she's experienced with her heavenly bridegroom.
So she's speaking from personal experience.
Definitely. And then she lays out 3 reasons for why people get married.
Besides just having kids.
Right. The first is for mutual support and spiritual growth. The second is to connect with the divine. And the third, she says, is to actually invite the divine into the marriage.
Like a three-way.
In a spiritual sense, yeah.
Okay, that's pretty intense.
And she says this third reason, it's been kept secret for a long time.
But why?
Because it's powerful knowledge.
Like, it could be misused.
Right. And she says it requires a lot of training and self-control to handle it properly.
So it's not for everyone.
It's definitely not. And there's also this fear that, like, if you're not careful, you could accidentally do black magic.
Whoa. Okay.
But she thinks that true initiates, they would never do that. They would only want good things.
So it's about having the right intentions.
Exactly. And she says you can't even get to the 3rd degree without living a pure life and aspiring to the divine.
So it's a long and difficult path.
Yeah. And she thinks that the first 2 degrees, they were probably taught symbolically through things like belly dancing.
Really?
She thinks that Western culture just misunderstood those practices.
Because we have such a negative view of sex.
Right. She contrasts that with Eastern traditions, where they see sex as more sacred.
So maybe they had a better understanding of the borderland principles.
Maybe. And she also talks about how the teaching of giving God the glory, it's been kind of corrupted.
Like people have turned it into something selfish.
Yeah. And she connects that to the Talmudic tradition of having secret names for God.
Like the most sacred name is only revealed to those who are worthy.
Right. And she says the same principle applies to borderland marriages.
So it's all about respecting the sacredness of the union.
Exactly. And she points to the ancient mystery traditions and sacred scriptures as examples of this.
Like they're using veiled language to protect the knowledge.
Yeah. And she even quotes the Book of the Pitris, which talks about how you need a guru to guide you through these teachings.
So you can't just figure it out on your own.
Right. And she ends that section by suggesting that the secret of the combination by twos and threes, that might refer to the two partners in a marriage and then God as the third.
So it's like a divine triangle.
Yeah, that's the idea. And then she gets into some more practical stuff. She talks about this example of a man's dream seeming to influence a woman's pregnancy.
Like some kind of thought transference?
Maybe. She's not sure if it was a direct violation of borderland laws or not, but she's leaning towards no.
Okay, so things can get pretty blurry between the realms.
Definitely. And then she talks about materialization, like how borderland visitors can sometimes appear in physical form.
Like the shower of gold in the myth of Danae.
Yeah, or the mist that sometimes appears in seances. And she also discusses the idea of the double, like a person's astral body.
And she wonders if those doubles can, like, travel between realms and even impregnate women.
It's a possibility, she says. But she also warns against people misusing this knowledge.
So there are ethical implications.
Oh, absolutely. And she thinks that the best protection is to live right and think clearly.
So your own moral compass is your guide.
Exactly. And she doubts that a virgin could get pregnant from a double because they exist on different planes of matter.
Okay, so there are limits to what's possible.
Right. But she does think that a borderland conception might be possible if the woman is living in alignment with both earthly and spiritual laws.
So it's got to be this perfect harmony.
Yeah. And she points to the story of Mary and Joseph, where they abstain from sex until after Jesus is born.
So that's like the ideal example.
Right. And then she contrasts that with the figure of the medieval witch.
Like the stereotypical witch who makes deals with the devil.
Yeah. And she says that both the witch and Mary had the potential for high-level borderland unions.
But the witch's fear and prejudice, it distorted her experiences.
Exactly. She thought she was dealing with the devil when it might have actually been an angel.
So her own mindset shaped her reality.
Right. And she thinks the same.